There is a vault beneath the United States, hidden not in banks or servers, but carved into salt caverns along the Gulf Coast. It holds hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil, sealed away for the day the world breaks. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And here's what nobody tells you. This stockpile was never meant to lower gas prices, smooth elections, or manage inflation. It was designed for catastrophe, for war, for supply collapse. Here's why this matters. When an emergency system becomes a routine tool, the shield meant to protect a nation can quietly thin out, until the moment it's needed most. This is where the pattern begins. The SPR was born out of fear. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo ripped through the U.S. economy. Gas lines stretched for miles. Inflation surged. Factories slowed. The nation realized, painfully, that it had no control over its own energy lifeline. In response, Congress authorized the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in 1975, mandating the creation of a massive emergency supply that could be released only during severe disruptions. By the early 1980s, oil was being pumped into underground salt domes, geological vaults capable of storing crude for decades. This was not about convenience, not politics, survival. For years, the reserve grew quietly. By 2009, it held over 720 million barrels, the largest emergency oil stockpile on Earth. Enough, on paper, to replace imports for months. Enough to deter adversaries who might consider weaponizing energy supply. Enough to calm markets during genuine crises. The SPR became America's oil insurance policy. Invisible, untouched, trusted. And then the line blurred. The first releases were rare and symbolic. During the 1991 Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush authorized a coordinated release with allies to stabilize markets amid fears of Middle Eastern disruption. Prices eased. The system worked. Again, in 2005, after Hurricane Katrina crippled Gulf Coast infrastructure, the SPR was tapped to offset lost production. Once more, the logic was clear. Physical supply shock, emergency response. Not price management. Crisis containment. But over time, the temptation grew. As oil markets became more volatile and politics more sensitive to fuel prices, the SPR shifted from shield to lever. Small releases became tools to calm markets. Sales were authorized not only for emergencies, but to raise revenue, balance budgets, or manage short-term disruptions. Each drawdown felt harmless, temporary, reversible. At first, it looked like flexibility. Then the bill arrived. Here's what nobody tells you. Emergency systems decay not when they fail, but when they succeed too often. Each successful use justifies the next. Each drawdown reframes expectations, and slowly, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. By the late 2010s, the SPR was no longer a sacred last resort. It was part of the conversation. Analysts discussed it as a policy instrument. Lawmakers debated selling oil to fund programs. The reserve shrank incrementally, unnoticed by most Americans. Yet its purpose remained unchanged on paper: to protect the nation during severe energy supply interruptions. Then came 2022. Global oil markets were already tight following the pandemic recovery. Supply chains were strained. Inflation surged. Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent shockwaves through energy markets. Gasoline prices climbed sharply. Political pressure intensified. And the United States turned to its deepest reserve. Beginning in early 2022, the Biden administration authorized the largest release in the history of the SPR, over 180 million barrels in a single year. By mid-2023, the reserve had fallen to levels not seen since the early 1980s. Roughly half of its peak capacity was gone. Here's why this matters. The release was not tied to a sudden physical shortage inside the United States. Refineries were operating. Imports continued. Instead, the SPR was used to counter price pressure, an economic condition, not an emergency disruption. Not war, not embargo, inflation. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. This moment marked a turning point in how emergency power is exercised. The SPR was no longer just insurance against catastrophe. It had become a pressure valve for political and economic stress. And that shift carries consequences rarely discussed. Here's the mechanism. Releasing oil from the SPR increases short-term supply, which can ease prices temporarily. Markets respond, gasoline falls, consumers breathe. But the effect is fleeting. The oil is gone. The reserve shrinks, and unless replenished, future capacity declines. Let me show you exactly how this compounds risk. When reserves fall, the deterrent effect weakens. Adversaries know the cushion is thinner. Markets price in vulnerability, and future disruptions, whether from hurricanes, wars, or embargoes, carry greater impact. The danger wasn't what they saw. It was what they ignored. Replenishing the SPR is not instant. Buying oil requires favorable prices, budget authority, and political will. Refill too fast, and prices rise. Refill too slow, and vulnerability lingers. Analysts suggest that refilling the SPR at scale could take years, not months, especially in a market constrained by geopolitical tension and underinvestment in production. Meanwhile, the signal sent to the world matters. When the United States draws heavily from its emergency reserve, allies take note. So do rivals. The SPR is not just barrels and salt caverns, it is a message about confidence, about readiness, about endurance. In earlier eras, the existence of a full SPR reassured markets that the U.S. could absorb shocks without panic. Now, with lower levels, that reassurance weakens, not collapse. Exposure. And this leads to a deeper pattern visible across modern governance. Emergency tools are increasingly used to manage chronic problems. Fiscal stimulus becomes routine. Central banks normalize crisis interventions. Strategic reserves become price stabilizers. Each step feels rational in isolation. Together, they redefine what emergency means. At first, it looks like responsiveness. Then the bill arrives. Because emergencies do not announce themselves on schedule. They overlap. A hurricane season collides with geopolitical tension. A war intersects with refinery outages. A cyber attack hits infrastructure during a supply crunch. The SPR was designed for this convergence, the moment when everything breaks at once. Here's the trap. Using the reserve to smooth normal volatility reduces its ability to absorb abnormal shocks. And rebuilding it becomes politically harder after prices fall and attention shifts. The incentive always favors use now over protection later. Some analysts argue the drawdowns were justified, an appropriate response to extraordinary global conditions. Others warn they set a precedent that weakens long-term energy security. Both can be true. But the structural question remains unresolved. What is the SPR for? Because if the answer is everything, then eventually it protects nothing. And now we arrive at the question that defines Section 2. If America's emergency oil reserve has been partially consumed to manage economic pressure, what happens when a true supply crisis arrives and the shield is no longer full? The answer lies not in politics, but in systems, in signals, in timing, and in the uncomfortable reality that emergency power, once normalized, loses its edge. The danger facing the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is not that it was used, it's how it was used, and what that reveals about modern crisis management. Here's what nobody tells you. When an emergency reserve becomes a routine policy tool, it stops functioning as a reserve at all. It becomes inventory, and inventory behaves very differently under pressure. Here's why this matters. The SPR was designed for rare, high-impact shocks. But once it is treated as a lever for everyday volatility, it quietly loses the very quality that made it powerful: deterrence. This is where the pattern completes itself. Analysts suggest that the massive drawdowns of 2022 changed how oil markets interpret American resilience. The release calmed prices in the short term, but it also introduced a new assumption: that the United States is willing to trade future security for present relief. Markets are adaptive. They remember signals. And once a signal is sent, it cannot be recalled. Not strength. Signal. Here's the mechanism. Energy markets price risk based on buffers. When buffers shrink, volatility rises. A thinner SPR means less margin for error. That margin matters during moments when supply is suddenly disrupted by hurricanes in the Gulf, conflict in the Middle East, or coordinated actions by exporters. In those moments, traders don't ask whether oil exists somewhere underground. They ask how fast it can be released, how much is left, and how confident policymakers appear. Confidence is a commodity too. At first, it looks manageable. Domestic production is high. Imports continue. Allies coordinate. Then the bill arrives. A simultaneous disruption. One scenario might involve a severe hurricane season paired with geopolitical escalation, tests the system. With fewer barrels available in reserve, response options narrow. Prices react faster. Political pressure escalates sooner. The cushion that once absorbed shock now transmits it. Some economists argue that the SPR's reduced size does not automatically imply vulnerability, pointing to America's increased domestic production and diversified supply chains. Others counter that production is not protection. Wells cannot surge overnight. Refineries require uninterrupted power and logistics. And domestic output does not insulate the U.S. from global pricing, because oil is a global market. If this pattern applies, then even energy exporters remain exposed to price spikes triggered elsewhere. This is the psychological trap. The existence of oil inside national borders creates an illusion of immunity. But pricing power lives in global flows, not domestic abundance. The SPR was designed to bridge that gap, to buy time while systems adjust. Reduce that bridge, and time becomes scarce. Let me show you exactly how this reframes future crises. Imagine a sudden disruption in a major exporting region. Prices spike. The public demands action. Policymakers look to the SPR but hesitate. Release too much, and the reserve approaches critical lows. Release too little, and prices continue rising. Every option carries risk. The flexibility that once existed is gone. The emergency tool has been pre-spent. This is where the trap closes. Emergency systems work best when they are boring, unused, unquestioned, quietly full. Once they become visible, politicized, and expected, they lose their strategic value. The SPR's greatest strength was never the oil itself. It was the uncertainty it imposed on adversaries and markets alike. No one knew how much would be released, when, or under what conditions. Now, those conditions appear fluid. The signal travels outward. Allies who coordinate releases with the U.S. reassess their own reserves. Should they follow suit and use emergency stocks for price control, or should they preserve them and risk domestic backlash? Exporting nations watch closely. Some analysts suggest that when consumer nations lean more heavily on reserves, producers gain leverage in future negotiations. Why? Because reserves are finite. Production, when coordinated, can be sustained longer. And then there is replenishment, the quiet, difficult problem no one likes to discuss. Refilling the SPR requires purchasing oil in open markets. That means competing with refiners, airlines, shipping firms, and foreign buyers. Buy too aggressively, and prices rise. Delay too long, and the reserve remains exposed. Analysts indicate that rebuilding the SPR to former levels could take years under normal conditions. Under stressed conditions, even longer. And every year spent partially depleted is a year of increased vulnerability. This leads to a deeper systemic observation. Modern governance increasingly relies on emergency tools to manage structural problems. Monetary policy substitutes for fiscal reform. Strategic reserves substitute for energy investment. Temporary measures become standing policy. Each intervention solves a problem today by borrowing resilience from tomorrow. At first, it looks like control. Then the bill arrives. The SPR's story mirrors this pattern exactly. Created in response to a singular crisis, it functioned well when used sparingly. But as crises multiplied, financial, geopolitical, environmental, the reserve was asked to do more than it was designed for. And now its role is ambiguous. Is it a wartime stockpile? A market stabilizer? A political pressure valve? If it is all three, it cannot excel at anyone. Here's what nobody tells you. Resilience is not built by reacting faster. It is built by having unused capacity, slack, redundancy, quiet strength. The SPR embodied that philosophy for decades. Its partial depletion is not catastrophic, but it is instructive. It shows how quickly extraordinary measures become normalized when pressure is constant. Looking ahead, several scenarios emerge. In one scenario, the U.S. successfully refills the SPR during periods of lower prices, restoring its deterrent role. Energy markets stabilize. The reserve fades back into the background. This would represent a soft landing, a return to original purpose. In another scenario, price volatility remains persistent, discouraging large-scale refilling. The SPR hovers at reduced levels, used episodically to manage spikes. Over time, it becomes less strategic and more tactical. Protection gives way to improvisation. And in a third, more fragile scenario, overlapping crises force repeated drawdowns before replenishment occurs. The reserve declines further. Markets begin to price in the absence of a true backstop. In this world, energy shocks propagate faster, political reactions intensify, and the cost of miscalculation rises sharply. None of these outcomes are guaranteed, but each reflects the same underlying tension. Emergency power is finite, and once spent, it cannot be conjured instantly. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was built for a world where shocks were rare but severe. The world now faces shocks that are frequent, overlapping, and unpredictable. That mismatch, not any single decision, is the real vulnerability. And this brings us to the final lesson. Here's what nobody tells you. America did not weaken its energy security by selling oil from the SPR. It weakened it by redefining what emergency means. When everything becomes urgent, nothing remains reserved. The SPR still exists. Oil still rests beneath the Gulf Coast. But its meaning has changed. And meaning matters in systems built on confidence. Because when the next true crisis arrives, the kind that does not care about polling cycles or price charts, the question will not be how quickly oil can be sold. It will be whether the shield was still there at all.